everybody, and welcome to the Women in Innovation webinar on leadership. My name is Shwan Smith and I run the Women in Innovation programme for the Knowledge Transfer Network. Just to run through some quick housekeeping with you beforehand. So there's a Q&A which will be held at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A box and I'll be reading them out from there. Please do not use the chat box for questions, as I will not be monitoring that during the Q&A session. As you might have noticed, that everyone has joined this webinar on mute, and unfortunately we will be keeping you on mute throughout, just to ensure that we are able to all hear the webinar. So the slides and recording will also be made available afterwards and will be circulated through to the email address that you registered with us. And now, just before we begin, I'm going to hand you over to Carolyn Hooker. Carolyn is a leadership and innovation specialist with the Enterprise Europe Network. She's based in Bristol and currently assisting with companies to take innovation to market. During her career, she has run the Women into Management programme for the Open University and contributed to the MBA. She's had her own company and become an executive leadership coach before joining the business growth unit of Grant Thornton in London, where she advised companies nationwide on leadership and employee engagement. She's been a fellow of CIPD, an affiliate of the Centre for Leadership Studies and the University of Exeter, and is currently a fellow of the RSA. So I'm going to hand over to Carolyn, who will run you through today's webinar.
Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining me on this day in April, and the sun is shining, and thanks to Shwan as well for the introduction. So this session is about leadership, and it's something that I've spent a lot of my career devoting time to. So that's both researching leadership, writing about it, observing, practicing it myself as a leader in various different positions, and also coaching managers in leadership skills. So oh gosh, sorry, I'm just going to get a grip on this. There we go. So apologies. So that was the introduction. So I'm actually going to look at three topics today. What makes a strong leader? Leading innovative companies and the skill set involved in that. And last but not least, which is obviously very topical, I do hope everybody's keeping well and keeping safe, but we're also going to have a brief look at leadership for the COVID-19 challenges that are facing all of us at the moment. So first of all, I'd like to actually start by considering some strong women leaders, and I've only picked a couple here. You'll probably recognize them quite quickly. One is Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, and the second one is Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And what we've got here, which I'd like to illustrate, is two very different leadership styles from two quite different women. So Greta is a very passionate individual. She's very directive, quite straightforward, highly motivated, very far-sighted. She's got an incredible vision for someone so young, and considering that she actually started her campaign sitting alone outside her school in Sweden, it's really quite remarkable what she's ended up doing today. Contrast her with Jacinda Ardern, who, to be fair, is considerably older, more established, but she's also quite different. She's very understated, very compassionate, but also very decisive. She's getting tremendous airplay at the moment for the way in which she's dealt with the COVID-19 crisis, locking down New Zealand very early on, but also showing a very compassionate style. And Jacinda would be the first to say that over the years, she's had a number of criticisms. Apparently, she's been criticised for being not aggressive or assertive enough. This is quite classic, really, for women leaders, if they don't act in the same way as men. And she says she totally rebels against that. And she says, I refuse to believe that you cannot be both compassionate and strong. So two quite different styles, really. Both of these women are not from the UK. So I'd just like to say that, you know, we can bring into the picture quite easily individuals like Deborah Meaden, who's famous from Dragon's Den, Karen Brady, who's been on The Apprentice, scientists, and then some perhaps lesser known women, Carolyn McCall, for instance, who was formerly chief executive at EasyJet and is now with ITV, and Anne Franker, who runs the Chartered Management Institute. So every leader needs a set of leadership skills that are going to stand them in good stead. And these are some of the 4 skills, but I do believe that they're some of the 4 fundamentals. So what we have here is we have self-awareness, understanding your behavior, but not just understanding your own behavior, but also understanding how that plays out within the company or an organization or a team. And that's actually really important. Secondly, communication. It's really important to be effectively communicating at every step of the way, not only goals and objectives, but also inspiring trust from the people who are expected to follow you as a leader. Thirdly, influencing. So it's really necessary as a leader to be comfortable persuading, promoting, and delegating. Now, I coach a number of different individuals, usually senior leadership, senior managers. And one of the aspects of influencing is dealing with politics. But it's interesting the number of times that people come back to me and say, actually, I don't do politics. I don't like it. I don't wish to know. And I always refute this by saying that, you know, politics with a small p in organizations as a leader is actually really important. It's absolutely necessary to be able to read situations, build alliances, lobby factions, influence key individuals, and affect the outcomes of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So really, politics for me is about having a finger on the pulse, but also setting the tempo of that pulse as well. And then last but not least, learning agility. So this is a really important aspect, and I think it's actually reads into self-awareness really strongly. It's just having the ability to knowing when to change course, but also being open to new ideas and actually making sure that you don't become stale in your leadership or management thinking. Then what I'd like to do is just have a quick look at leadership cultures. And I appreciate that this is pretty much a sort of whistle-stop tour really through leadership because it's an enormous topic. But just for the sake of it, let's look at 3 different types of leadership cultures. So on the left-hand side, the first one is very much a dependent or a hierarchical culture. So there's a belief in these kind of cultures that people in authority should be responsible for leadership. So in these kind of areas, you've got certain types of organizations, and I'm going to generalize, but it might be companies, organizations like the armed forces or ones that operate in the defense or aerospace sector. Secondly, then, there's an independent culture. Now, this is where you might have somebody who's the center cog in the middle of the wheel, as it were, but you've also got a number of strong individuals or partners out on the outside. And this is typically seen in, say, for instance, law firms, accountancy practices, management consultancies, and some engineering firms and IT companies. And last but not least, there's interdependent cultures. I would say that these are probably a little bit rarer in my experience. For 10 years, I consulted up and down the UK with a number of different companies, and the interdependent culture is probably a little bit more unusual. But there's a belief in this culture that leadership is a collective activity. So it may turn up in manufacturing companies that maybe have a lot of cell working on the shop floor and possibly a high focus on Japanese style management techniques. It's sometimes more obvious in universities and research councils, although the independent culture is also equally strong. And it may also be there in some social enterprises, but it's not an exclusive list at all. And you may already be thinking of other cultures that you've experienced. And also organizations quite often have subcultures too. So becoming a leader, it's really important to develop what I call leadership competence. But how do we actually go about that? How does it happen? So I'm just going to walk us through this particular model because it's one I return to time and time again. And it's really called the model of conscious competency. So you may have come across it. But there are two aspects to this. So along the bottom end of the scale, we've got time. So if we go back down to the far left-hand corner, that's when time the clock is just beginning to start ticking. And then with the upward axis, we've got performance. And you can see that there are a number of notches in increases in performance. So to illustrate this, think about, if you're a car driver, think about when you learned to drive a car. If you don't drive a car, just think about maybe learning to use a particular piece of new software. So at the very first stage, down at the bottom left-hand side, you have what we call is unconscious incompetence. So I'll just explain that because it's quite a difficult set of words to say. But what happens is that when you get in a car, you may have observed other people driving cars. You've sat as a passenger in a car over time and you've thought, my goodness, that looks easy. So you're unconsciously incompetent. But once you sit in the driving seat, it's a completely different matter. With a software program, you might again think that you've used various programs already, so another one shouldn't be too difficult. But until you actually start, until you actually become a novice, you don't really know. You're pretty much in the dark. So when you move from novice to advanced beginner, you suddenly become consciously incompetent. So this is the point at which you're in the car, you're driving, but you're not terribly confident and you haven't had enough experience to actually experience a lot of incidences or things that might happen. I don't know, somebody stepping out in front of you. With a software program, it's more about the fact that you perhaps don't know all of the ins and outs of it. So you have become conscious, but you do know that you're not completely competent yet. When you move to the next level, you become much more conscious and proficient, and this is where you get into your comfort zone, basically. So moving on from there, the next level is once again unconscious competence, because everything just flows. Everything becomes easy. As a car driver, you really don't think about where you're driving. You might go onto automatic pilot, arrive somewhere and not really have a conscious memory of getting there. And equally with a software program, it just becomes a tool that you're using. Now, some of us are lucky to move on to something called mastery, but what we also experience is that we may drop back into complacency and we may have to relearn some of the tools and techniques that we need. So becoming a leader, if you think back about your experience, I guess, of becoming a leader and my experience of becoming a leader, this has to happen, I believe, over time. It's not something that comes very quickly. Sometimes it's not something that comes hugely easily. And certainly one of the authors that I've read, Malcolm Gladwell, maybe you have too, he's a New York Times bestseller, has produced 5 books. One of particular interesting one is called Outliers. And you might have heard this in popular discussion about needing 10,000 hours to become proficient in something. And obviously that's to get to a level of mastery, but in fact 10,000 hours to practice being a leader is only 270 weeks, and 270 weeks is only 5 years. So you might be training for something else, you might be training to play a musical instrument, you might be training for a marathon, but basically, you know, 5 years, is that such a long time? And I would say that probably with the amount of situations that leaders can be presented with, 5 years is probably about right to get there in terms of your leadership proficiency. Okay, so there's another author who I often turn to called Stephen Covey, part of the Franklin Covey organization. And this is all about the 7 habits of highly effective people. So again, you might have come across this before, but I'll just go through it briefly because I think it's a fantastic framework for leaders to be able to use and keep with them and be reminded by it. So the first part of this model is being proactive. And what we know is that between every stimulus, every situation, and the response that we make, as human beings, we've got the freedom to choose. We've got the freedom to choose what we do. So there's a difference between being proactive and reactive. What I tend to see in a lot of work that I do with companies is a lot of companies that have got into a comfortable position, a lot of leaders, a lot of business owners who maybe have got to a point where they just become reactive a lot of the time. And some of my work and the work that my colleagues do in terms of innovation, taking those innovations to market and actually rejuvenating some of the products and services, it really helps to actually keep a proactive frame of mind. Secondly, begin with the end in mind. So when I go and discuss companies and what they're doing, I'm always really interested in what their objectives are, what their goals are, what the strategy is, what exactly is the intended outcome. And a really good question for leaders to keep posing to themselves and to the people that they work with is, what exactly are we trying to achieve here? What is the goal? Putting first things first. So there's a particular way of looking at this within the framework of habits of highly effective people, which I will say is based on a number of highly effective people who were studied, is always to try and distinguish every day when you start the day between what is urgent, important, not urgent, and not important. And the leaders I see who are being really smart about this are always trying to distinguish first what is urgent but also important. So it's always good to keep those two aspects in mind. Next, it's about think win-win. This comes from game theory, which again is a part of leadership development and leadership theory. And in game theory, there are all sorts of outcomes: lose-lose, I win, you lose, I lose, you win, or win-win. And actually, when you're dealing with a situation, whether it's a tricky negotiation or it's asking some people to do something for you, thinking win-win is always a good approach. What's in it for both sides? Seek first to understand rather than be understood. A number of leaders can fall into the trap, and it's always something that, you know, we do as humans. We switch on to broadcast mode. We're very quick to tell people what they should do, how they should think, and what we expect of them. But really, this principle is about having empathetic communication and checking in with people, which is terribly important at the moment as well, with the way that we're all working differently, but also to really find out what somebody else is thinking. So seek to understand them first rather than being understood yourself. Number 6 is synergize. So that's all about creative cooperation, think holistically, and it's all about the sum of the parts. And the last one is sharpen the saw. It's an odd title, but it means take a break. It means as a leader, it's really important to look after the self, your own self. It's not selfish, it is important. So self-renewal, and it's just really important to make sure that you're always checking that if you're going to saw up a log of wood, that was the analogy or the metaphor that was given, always make sure that your saw is sharp rather than being blunt, because if you're working with blunt tools, it's much, much harder work. Okay, I have another model here which I'd like to briefly explain, and all of these are referenced at the end of the presentation, so if you want to dip into some of them afterwards, please do. There are books and resources to go to. So this is the primary colours leadership model. And it's in 3 domains. So first of all, at the top, we have the strategic domain. Down on the right-hand side, we have the interpersonal domain. And over on the left-hand side, we have the operational domain. And all of them are interlinked, and all of them are essential for leaders to at least pay some attention to. It's quite easy to think of these in terms of the hand, heart, and the head. So we've got the head at the top, the heart on the right-hand side, and the hands doing the work on the left-hand side. You might notice also that it talks about 8 tasks of leadership, but actually if you count around the model, you can only find 7. So I just need to say that the 8th one, which they like to overlay on top of this model, is really the difficulty of juggling all of these different areas and how a leader is able to handle pressure and how they're able to rise to the challenges and really manage their own stress. So any leaders that we're working with at the moment, they have a really, really tough job on their hands. Setting strategic direction at the moment is incredibly complicated. A lot of well-laid plans have actually gone out of the window. Even as we move around the model, building sustaining relationships is also complex because we're all, those of us who are at work, a number of us are working remotely. Those people who are in work are actually still going to workplaces in factories and shop floors, and essential workers, the NHS or whatever, to some extent are having to rethink their relationships, how they work together, and also to maintain things like social distancing, which is incredibly new for us. And then in delivering results, a lot of business owners are struggling, they've maybe had to furlough people, and the results are not going to actually be what they originally intended. So keeping all of these areas afloat, as it were, and actually juggling all these different circles is very difficult. So the research that was done with the primary colours leadership model also discovered that it's very difficult for one person to do all of this proficiently or to a very high standard. So we're always very quick to point at leaders and look at some of their faults, but also we need to bear in mind that actually this is complicated. Probably one of the worst things to do, though, is to not pay attention to the strategic domain or actually setting a direction. And this is called, within the model, it's called something called absent leadership. So sometimes in businesses, we see leaders who prefer to work in the business rather than on the business. And that's really the distinction. If you're working in the business, you're really concentrating on the planning and organizing, the delivering results and working with people. But to work on the business means that every so often you've really got to lift your head up above the day-to-day and concentrate on setting a strategic direction and making sure that that remains the best possible for the company. So there's a lot for leaders to consider, really. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next topic now, and I'm going to have a look at leading innovation. And again, there's some resources at the end of the presentation which you might like to have a look at, which I won't go into in too much detail. But certainly in leading innovation, in my experience, and also from the research, it's terribly important to do a number of key things. One of these is to identify issues and patterns with customers. Certainly at the moment, it's incredibly important to keep in touch with customers and make sure that those links are not severed during this particular period of time. But also when you're leading innovation as well, and you're thinking about this and you're thinking about R&D as well, you've also got to be identifying issues in the wider environment, in market trends, but also not forgetting the customer too. And with the customer, it's not necessarily what they want, but it's actually what the customer needs. Another idea within innovation is really always remaining curious and frequently asking why. Why is something happening? Why is it not happening? Why are we doing it this way? Could we do it a different way? What are the possibilities? So it's really, even though you're head down in a project, perhaps getting something together, working on a software as a service or something in manufacturing, it's always necessary to keep asking, could this be done better? Why are we doing it this way? Terribly important as well to encourage different perspectives. Certainly things like hackathons, have been a fantastic recent development to enable some of the bigger companies particularly to include thousands of people in discussions about different perspectives and ways of doing things, about different pilots that might be started. But also open hackathons are also very good for that kind of thing. And large organizations can then start to pilot things with very small SMEs, for instance, just to really have a go at something different. Also within R&D, even though it can be incredibly well planned and systematized, it's also important occasionally to let people mess up because it is about experimentation. And certainly within R&D, it's also incredibly important to be using pilots, trials, and running different projects. And I guess some of you are already involved in a lot of those kind of activities. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any consensus really about whether there's something like an innovation skill set, but there are some aspects of innovation which you might want to consider. It helps to obviously be working with smart people. And obviously the kind of intelligence that we're going to get in different industries, different sectors is going to vary. So that's going to be very different in the creative industries, say to engineering, to biotech, or to quantum technologies, all of which our team visit. But generally, you are going to be dealing with quite smart people. And smart people can actually be a bit tricky to lead because they obviously know a lot of things. They're incredibly professional, very committed. So it's always very important if you're in a leadership position in innovation, working with intelligent people, to really have a think about how you lead professionals. And there's a book that I've referenced at the end of the presentation, which is all about that, and has just come out on the top 10 for the Chartered Management Institute list for 2020. And I've got a copy, and I'm also giving it to the individuals that I'm currently coaching in their leadership skills. So I would recommend that. It's necessary within innovation as well to maintain a sense of curiosity, but to some extent that does need to be disciplined. Integrity, that's fairly obvious. Coachability, that's an odd word. I think it's probably an American invention, but it really refers back to what we were talking about in terms of self-awareness and learning agility. And with all companies that are innovative companies, wanting to bring new products, new services to market, one of the conversations that I often have with senior leadership teams is, to what extent are you able to reach outside of your company, outside the organization, and bring in some extra expertise and support? So that might be a coach. So obviously a leader who's willing to be coached is fantastic, because it does mean that they're open to a lot more possibilities. But also it might be a non-executive director. And have you got somebody on your board who is really asking a lot of questions and making sure that you're heading in the right direction? So in R&D, I experience a lot of R&D setups. Some of them are highly systematized. The approach that they take is very much governed by the board. It's governed by getting projects through, having them approved, and then having project management systems that work very, very efficiently. And at the other end of the spectrum, it could be incredibly informal. So if you're in a small SME, if you run a small SME, or if you work with people in small SMEs, the approach to R&D doesn't necessarily have to be informal, but quite often it is. And often what I say to people in those kind of management and senior leadership teams is, again, think about making some of this a bit more formalized, so that you've got much more of a track record of how you're actually managing your R&D and how you could go about actually improving how you manage your R&D. Because again, that is incredibly important. Okay, we're moving on to a slightly different topic now then, and I wanted to include this because obviously this is a session for women in innovation, and last time I gave a presentation about women in innovation, the question came up, well, what are the male-female leadership differences? Do they actually exist? And this is a very interesting area, and it's also something that is being increasingly looked upon, so that's incredibly encouraging. But what I'd also like to do at this particular point is ask you to do something for me, which is we have a poll set up about what you think about male and female leadership differences. So I'm just going to hand over, and we're just going to run a quick poll, not for very long, just for about 40 seconds, for you to answer some very basic questions about what you think about male-female leadership differences. So please have a go at doing the poll. I'm just going to check if the poll is working. Okay, I understand the poll is working. Okay, fantastic. Thank you all very much. So we've got a 93% result in that you believe that there are differences between male and female leadership styles. Thank you very much for having a go at that. Brilliant. So I think you'll probably be really interested then in the next set of slides. If I can get those to work. Oops. Okay, right, we're there. So this is based on some recent research, which has been fairly extensive, and a book has been written. But first of all, confidence, we have found out, is no substitute for competence. So I'm going to explain that. What happens is that we've discovered that women in general are very competent and very capable of going for leadership positions. Where they struggle is that they may not have the same level of confidence as men. Men tend to have a great deal of confidence and think that they are suitable for senior leadership positions. Women actually question themselves when it's quite clear from the research that they do indeed have the competence. I know there are other reasons why women don't go for senior leadership positions, and we could get into a discussion about the situational aspects of this and the work-life balance aspects and all of those, but I just want to take those out of the equation for the moment and have a look at these aspects. So secondly, in terms of self-awareness, this is very preferable to self-belief. What we find is that men generally have higher self-reported scores of self-belief. So that makes sense because we've already identified that they do appear to be more confident than women. So their self-belief is very high, but it's not as high as their self-awareness. And interestingly, women tend to be much more self-aware. And what we've discovered is that in leadership positions, and what we've also looked at in some of the skills and everything else, is that self-awareness is quite an important skill set. It's quite an important approach to have if you're going to be a leader. So what we're already looking at is that men have increased confidence and are more likely to go for jobs, even though the women have the competence, but they're also more likely to have high self-belief and potentially less self-awareness, whereas what we're actually looking for is high competence, high self-awareness. Now, the other point is that EQ also in leadership positions triumphs over IQ. So this is emotional intelligence over intellectual ability. So when you get to a leadership position, generally you are going to be leading people. And people are complicated. A lot of leaders describe to me that the people that they have in the company, for them, they feel it's a bit like a black box. You know, especially if they prefer to work in terms of processes, or if they work in manufacturing or something in engineering, you know, where there are tangible things that you can actually pin down, or even developing software. It's not like working with people. Working with people is complicated. So the more emotional intelligence, or the higher scores for emotional intelligence that you have, should equip you to be a better leader. And again, what we find interestingly is that overall women have a tendency to have higher scores in emotional intelligence over IQ. And then last but not least, it's really important to put people before yourself. And interestingly, if you're an individual who's overly confident and prone to a lot of self-belief, you're not likely to put people before yourself. I can pick on some interesting leaders who we have in the public domain. I don't know, should we take Steve Jobs? I mean, Steve Jobs was not renowned for putting other people before himself. Incredibly special and fantastic entrepreneur, very, very passionate about what he did. But, you know, he probably had an over excess of confidence and an over excess of self-belief. So what we see interestingly from the research is, despite the fact that women are really, really equipped to be leaders, and obviously we are gaining more and more women leaders every year, generally it's the men who consider themselves to be better equipped and who generally go for the actual appointments. We also know that in recruitment situations, and this is a classic situation, that men will often apply for a role if they are only 60%, or believe that they can only 60% cover what is in the job description. Women frequently need to be able to cover 100%, or that's what they believe. They believe that they have to be able to do 100% of the job description before they'll put themselves forward. There's also another interesting aspect of leadership, and that is what's called the imposter syndrome. And women are much more likely to suffer a little bit more from this than for men. And from what I've outlined, you can probably see why that would happen. But there's some positives in this. Although we know that artificial intelligence is probably going to hijack a number of technical skills that we have in the workplace, as automation increases, we also know that the soft skills and the need for soft skills will remain. So it's very important that we have more women going into leadership positions. And what we have had previously is an over-reliance on expecting men to be leaders. And the difficulty with this is that when women go into leadership positions, they're quite often on their own, or there's fewer women in those positions. And we need to reach a point where that changes. But maybe there's some positives in here, because with automation in the workplace, the technical skills are going to be covered off, but there is going to be a lot of interest in having strong soft skills, which are the ones that we've been looking at. Okay, so now I want to move on to something which is much more topical, and here we have a picture of our beautiful, beautiful world, which at the moment is actually shrouded in a mask, and we may be getting to that point very soon. It's certainly a very difficult environment that we're actually operating in. So, COVID-19 challenges. What can we possibly bring to bear in terms of leaders in this time of COVID-19, which is completely unprecedented, as we all know? Well, there are lessons from the recessions, because recessions have been studied and how leaders act in recessions has been looked at. And it has to be said that fortune favours the brave. So there have been recessions for the last 30 years. There was one in the early 80s, one in the early 90s, and we had this quite severe one in 2007-8. And we also know that, in fact, you probably need to experience about 2 or 3 recessions to be very competent at dealing with them, which kind of goes back to the model of competency again. You know, how much time has to pass before you're really skilled and adept at actually dealing with a very difficult set of circumstances. So just very briefly, let's have a look at a bit of a case study, because this for me is an interesting one. So this is a very recognizable company, John Lewis. In the recent financial press, they've been attracting quite a bit of attention for a whole load of reasons that I will explain. And it's been said that they're definitely going to need speed, flexibility, and decisive leadership to get out of the current situation. And this is really what every leader needs during a recession. They need to act quickly, they need to be flexible, really fleet of foot, and they need to be decisive. So in terms of John Lewis, we used to have Charlie Mayfield as the chairperson, but recently Dame Sharon White has taken over. So she's the first woman ever to be put in charge of John Lewis. Since actually becoming the chairperson, John Lewis has been forced to shut 50 branches of its department store, and it's actually done this for the first time in its 155-year history. Operating profits have dropped 84% to 40 million over the last 3 years. So that's a massive drop in operating profits, even before COVID-19 hit them. So there's been another massive shock to the system. But the really positive thing for John Lewis is that it's been able to deploy a lot of its department store staff into Waitrose. So as far as we know, a lot of individuals have actually been shifted to work in the retail food section of the business. So it's a fantastic opportunity, because obviously we've already lost House of Fraser and Debenhams from the high street, but John Lewis, because it had Waitrose, was able to redeploy its staff. Also, John Lewis has a partnership model, which is very different to a normal hierarchical organisation. And employee trusts, which are different to their partnership model, but employee trusts have been gaining a little bit of traction in the last 3 to 5 years, which is a very interesting development because it's actually starting to shift some of the responsibility from the top team and beginning to make it much more distributed. So one of the examples of an organisation I know which has gone down the road of setting up an employee trust has been Riverford Organics. So you might have come across Guy Watson-Singh, who's the chief executive of Riverford Organics, actually talking on Radio 4. Very interesting character. But in a recession, even if you're not John Lewis, you've got to be doing this. You've got to be steadying the ship. So in a nutshell, customers are king and cash flow is also king. Every effort that you make has really got to be about customers and cash flow. We've already thought about confidence. It's nothing without competence. You've got to have both. Probably an extra dollop of confidence is going to be really helpful in the current environment. So if you're a leader, if you know other leaders, it's all about maintaining levels of confidence and finding ways to be able to do that for yourselves. And also, interestingly, finding the moral rebels. So there's recently been some research about the bystander effect. Although social psychologists have been aware of this for many years, it's really all about the tendency for, if there's a major incident and a lot of people are present, human beings have a tendency to be less likely to intervene and come to the help of whoever is struggling or whoever is in a dangerous situation. So there's a strong tendency in humans to conform and to expect somebody else to take action, more so when there are actually more of us involved. But I'd like to also flag up some really positive things that in COVID-19 and the challenges that we've currently got, what we're beginning to see is more moral rebels, those people who don't necessarily conform, those people who tend to be a bit more extrovert, a bit more confident in their own judgment, prepared to risk looking stupid, feeling embarrassed and attracting attention, and actually putting themselves into a situation and trying to sort things out. So there's been some fantastic stories in the press, on the TV, in the papers, and I'm sure you're all aware, and we've all been sharing them as well, about the kind of people who are just bringing communities together, funding for the NHS, doing all sorts of fantastic things. And moral rebels tend to make more natural leaders. They're less likely to be bystanders. So they have a script running, which is more to do with the fact that they're saying to themselves, we're all responsible. This is what we can do together. We have to act. And if nobody else is going to, I will. So one of my questions for today, really, not for a poll, won't ask you that, but it's just to ask yourself, how much of a moral rebel are you, and how much are you prepared to step into the leadership space? And if not, who could you use as a role model? But I'd also say that female attributes are very important here, and it's also about having the empathy and also wanting to serve other people. And I do think that certainly with these COVID-19 challenges, we're seeing an awful lot of women step up to the plate, which is fantastic. Last but not least, it's all hands to the pump. I guess you would have expected that. And also, really, in a time like this, we need to be appealing to people's hearts and minds. There's a big distinction between leadership and management. Management is the doing, but leadership is the acting and is the going out in front and actually holding that banner. And there's a difference here between what we call transactional and transformational leadership. Transactional leadership is incredibly important. It's about the nuts and bolts. It's all about making things happen. But transformational leadership in times like these is incredibly important. And that's where you speak to people's hearts and minds. There's a lot of discussion online at the moment about remote workers still being a community and how we can get remote workers to be a community. But I'd also like to move this up a gear. I'd like to give us a bigger challenge, because there's something here about creating a tribe with your team, with your company, with your business. Can you step beyond just being a community? A community is there for its community members, obviously, incredibly important. It's about keeping people together, about helping people to identify and have a common goal. But if you're creating a tribe, my goodness, you're doing something quite different. You're actually really really making some very strong bonds. You're creating a real sense of togetherness, and a tribe will really fight for its members. So this relates to a lot of information about high performance team working. I haven't got time today to go into that, but high performance team working is very much about creating a tribe from a community. So let's also remember that. And then last but not least, we've got a second poll for you. So we're going to put up the second poll, and you can have a go at answering that one, and we'll see what we get in terms of responses. So what are you currently spending most time on? And you've got some options here to answer. And again, I think we've got about 40 seconds for that. I'm assuming the results will appear very quickly. Great. Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a 61% of you chasing new opportunities. Fantastic. Well done. 13% surviving on just getting business done, and business as usual, 24%. Okay, wonderful. It's great to see so many people chasing opportunities. This is a fantastic time to be thinking about innovations. Okay, I'm going to finish up. If I can. Oh, sorry. Just go back one. Okay, so let's have a quick look at possible new trends. This has been taken from some future forecasting work, which I've been scanning at the moment. So I'm just going to whiz through 4 possible trends. The social benefits of tech. As technology is providing an essential lifeline to us during this time, we're hopefully going to value it considerably more and not go back to not valuing and not using it. So that could change the way we think, the way our society is. On-demand lifestyles, so it's very much a case of not being able to go anywhere, being in lockdown, so we're actually becoming more digitally savvy, let's hope. Is there going to be some reinvigorated collectivism? So the depth of the impact of this particular crisis on businesses and the economy could well, we could well see arising from that an increase in the support for public expenditure and also for social safety nets. And considering that we've become a very unequal society of late, maybe that will be a good thing. But what about this one as well? Potential loss of autonomy. So we've got some number of things which are playing around in this. If to come out of lockdown, we all have to be vaccinated. If we've all got to accept to be tracked by apps, is that going to precipitate a bit of a decline in optimism and confidence of us being able to be truly autonomous and independent? I think probably not. You'll have your own views as well, but generally these are some of the trends that you could have a look out for in going for those new opportunities, creating new products, creating new services. Do they play into any of these aspects? This information comes from the Trajectory Partnership, but there's also others, Henley Centre for Forecasting, etc., etc. And I know that a lot of you are also fantastically having a look at new opportunities. So here are a couple of tools for leading innovation, for actually working with together with your colleagues, with your teams, with your companies. One of them is the business model canvas, which you can find at strategizer.com. This is a model which is used in business schools internationally. Our team use it extensively with our clients, and you can sign up and do an interactive session with the business model canvas. It enables you to really ask important questions of yourself as you're actually thinking about creating a new product or a new service and taking it to market. It's very thorough, goes through everything from the value proposition right through to, is there going to be enough gross profit in this, and what's your revenue stream going to be? What is your business model? And then secondly, from the KTN, there's also the Innovation Canvas, which again is an absolutely fantastic resource for you, available online. has another look at things like what the offer is going to be, what some of the risks are, what the gaps might be in the market, and some of the opportunities that you could seek to fill. So again, it's a really, really very useful model. Okay, I've actually got to the end of my presentation. So I am going to hand over. These are some references and acknowledgements that you might like to study and have a look at later. And thank you very much for answering the polls. And I think now we've got time for questions.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It was a fantastic webinar. So I've got a few questions which I'm going to ask you now, just before we finish. So first question, in your experience, what is the best way to develop leadership skills?
Okay, thanks, Siwan. I'm a fantastic exponent, really, of experience, and I deal with this on a regular basis with the individuals that I coach, the senior managers that I coach. So really, it's all about experience. It's about getting stuck in there. It's about being prepared to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from them. Also, I think it's really important to have positive role models. I don't know what it is, but there's something about the Brits. The Americans do this so well. The Americans absolutely adore positive role models. We seem to be much more reluctant, but I would say find a really positive role model. When I talk to senior leaders, they often say that they're doing things because they had a previous boss whose leadership style they didn't really like, so they do things that are opposite. Well, I'd like to turn that on its head and say, you know, let's get out there and find some positive role models that we can all use. And then also, of course, there's training and development. So, you know, there's a huge amount of training out there. There's some fantastic university courses at the moment which are being offered free online if anyone wishes to sign up for those. But, you know, there's a whole range of things. But generally, I think it's really important to actually think about being in a group with your peers, because in my experience, times when I was with the Open University, when I trained people through CIPD, when I ran ILM programs, that's the Institute of Learning and Management, a lot of the time I would actually give over to peer group learning, because it's an incredibly powerful aspect of learning at this particular level. And if you're trying to learn from experience, you can always learn from other people's experiences. So I would say that.
Thank you. Right, okay, so we've got a couple of people who have asked for references for books. As you can see on the screen, there's a list of the references there. These slides will be circulated afterwards, as well as the recording, so you will have these to hand as well. So going on to our next question then. So we've got one on how can women be encouraged to become innovators?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. And the KTN and Innovate UK are making really exciting inroads into this with this series, obviously, of webinars, but also face-to-face events that you were able to do before the lockdown. And also the Blue Plaque scheme as well, which I thought was amazing, whereby those women innovators who won awards were able to have blue plaques taken to their schools and actually put up in schools for all of the pupils to see, so that the whole idea of creating a woman role model who'd been to a particular school and then had gone on to actually achieve something amazing and something innovative, that got fantastic press. So that was really exciting. The other thing is to be part of an innovative community. So we've got some fantastic co-working spaces around the country. We've got a huge number of innovation accelerators that people can get onto. We've got future leaders programs. It really is a very rich environment. And also at the moment, I know, although we're suffering some restraints and constraints on the way that we work, but also it may be freeing up time for women to actually become more creative and think about new things that they could actually bring to market. So it's a time of opportunity, but it's also a time of constraint. But it's fantastic to see a lot of you on the poll are actually being able to make good use of this time. And also I understand that there will be a lot of business leaders out there who are really just trying to take care of customers and take care of cash.
Thank you, Carolyn. So we've got another one, which is in the tech space, in my experience, leadership is predominantly male. As a female leader in this minority, how can we influence men to adapt to female leadership styles?
Great. What a wonderful question. Yes. And I appreciate what you're saying. Yes, we do have a lot of very skilled, very clever men leading in the tech space, and it may not leave too much room for women. But it's terribly important that we step into that space and do some correction also of some of the AI algorithms and all of the biases that we've been learning about in the last couple of years. So my thoughts about that is that men in tech spaces like clear thinking, clear speaking, and they like people to be directive. I think probably the tendency for women to be stronger on things like EQ and empathy and being quite sociable doesn't play itself that well in that space. So it's really important, I feel, for leaders to be flexible. So in the days when I was visiting a whole range of businesses, it might have been a recycling plant, it might have been a design agency. But prior to walking through the door of that business, I would actually school myself into some of the ways of acting that I thought were going to be appropriate for that environment. So I would counsel women in the tech space to not become like men, because I'm not sure that I agree with Sheryl Sandberg's leaning in and, you know, being terribly assertive and very directive if that's not your personal style. But having said that, sometimes you've just got to go with the flow, and it helps to actually mimic. Yeah, women can be good mimics, and actually to another phrase is fake it till you make it. You know, be a bit more like, be a bit, actually communicate in ways that is more comfortable for the other people in that environment. And that is a good leadership activity to engage yourself in, is to really step out of your comfort zone and have a go at something that's a bit different. Not sure if that really helps, but that's my take on it. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Carolyn. We've got one more that says, can you share any tips or techniques to help introduce some formality to innovation in an SME when the boards are not used to that approach? I think you've mentioned some before, but if there's any more.
Right, okay. Well, certainly in terms of a continuum that I work on, whereas we've got very informal approaches at one end and more formal approaches at the other end, I'm just going to describe what I consider to be the more formal approach. And I would recommend that boards in small SMEs do actually consider this. So it would be to have board meetings whereby proposals are put to the board, and discussions take place about the actual fors and against of particular proposals. All proposals should be fully costed. They should be based on realistic ambitions to get to market. Those should be acid tested by also marketeers to see how realistic they are. They should also be checked in with financial directors, and if you haven't got one, then try and do that with a non-executive director or somebody who's a critical friend. Once you've got past that stage of the board actually being able to agree to a proposal, then it's really important to actually practice some performance, some project management techniques. So to make sure that you've got particular gateways where you're going to be checking and balancing proposals when they actually go into project working, to make sure that they're still on track, both in terms of time, but also in terms of money, and the fact that the market is still there and is still going to be wanting this kind of development. So really, I think once you've got beyond the board stage of actually acid testing everything, and you can use the innovation canvas and the business model canvas for that, it's really about actually finding a project management style that works for the company. And obviously at one end we've got Prince2. You know, anybody trained in Prince2 will know that it's incredibly thorough, but at the other end we've also got some, you know, tools and techniques on software that's openly available, where you can still do some of that, but perhaps not to such a great extent. But it's just really important to be mindful that you actually do need to have these things in place to keep ideas, to keep people in check, to make sure that progress is monitored, and also to make sure that at the end of the day, you know, you're going to come out with something that is really needed and wanted.
Okay, so our next question is, given that men and women seem to lead in different ways, I'm interested in how we can get the two to work together in senior management teams, given the different approaches.
Okay, yes, that's a really key one actually. And in senior management teams, we quite often have more men than there are women, and that is actually quite a difficult thing. Obviously, this varies by sector. If you were to step inside many NHS trusts, you would find that they're led by extremely competent women. Certainly in the public sector, we've probably had more women in senior management posts than we perhaps had in the private or the business sector. But enabling them to work together, I think sometimes it's just really important to actually become consciously aware of some of these issues and to raise them. Also to be prepared to meet men with equal confidence, but not necessarily to do it in the same way that men would do it. So there's a lot of sense in being just very clear, very aware of what it is that you want to happen, and just becoming practiced at interjecting some of the discussions that take place where women may find it difficult to interject, but just finding a way of breaking into discussions and actually putting across a different perspective. And that's what we'd really like to see in increasing diversity on boards, for instance. We know from research that more diverse boards, there are early indications that they're much more successful boards with higher performance across an organization. So I'm involved with Be On Board, which is a Bristol charity which looks at increasing opportunities for individuals from minorities and diverse backgrounds. And really, it's terribly important that we put our efforts behind that as well.
Brilliant. Right, so we are running out of time now, but I am going to take two more questions. So I hope I'm not running into anybody else's next meeting or spare time. So I'll just get on with that now. So what do you think is the most important characteristic to gain as a leader, and what is the focus to focus on in leadership of the COVID-19?
Okay, the most important characteristic as a leader for me is to know your people and to be in regular communication and to be factoring that into decision making. And certainly, I do think that that is incredibly important in COVID-19. And if you're not that close to the customer, then you really need to be communicating with those people who are close to the customers. So that might be a subset of your organization or your company. And it's very much about communicating and seeking to understand first before being understood. There is obviously an importance that you've got to make very quick, agile decisions, but those need to be based on as much intelligence as you can possibly garner. And the more successful leaders that I see have got fantastic deputies who cover off areas of that primary colours leadership model that they're not very good at, but also they really have got their finger on the pulse, and that's got to be about actually communicating regularly.
Perfect. So our final question is, as a woman leader in a new startup, I usually have to deal with people with more experience who can be assertive, for example, during negotiations. What advice would you give to young women?
Okay. I think assertiveness training and some of the thinking around assertiveness is incredibly important. So my go-to place would be to learn some assertive scripts, which just stand you in good stead if you're in a difficult situation and a tight corner. The other thing about negotiations as well is to call for time out. If you're finding it hard, if you're finding it difficult, just say, that's a great point. I really appreciate that, but I think we're just going to wheel back for 5 minutes because I need to reflect on that. I need to consider this, or, we just need to take a little bit of the heat out of this. Certainly very bright, intelligent people in SMEs where they're terribly passionate about what it is that they're doing. That is great. You do need to have that, but it's also just really important to be able to keep control of the conversation. So I don't necessarily think it's always about coming back with a response necessarily, but it is about controlling the type of conversation that you're having and being able to remain in charge of that. And I think when women practice that, they do start to feel a lot more comfortable. You may not have all the answers, but you just need the time, and you just need to be able to control what happens in the conversations.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. So we're going to end the Q&A session there, and I'm going to say a huge thank you to Carolyn today for introducing the topic of leadership, numerous theories, and providing us with her brilliant advice on that session. Just before we wrap up, I'm going to highlight some things for you. So we've got the Women in Innovation newsletter. If you'd like to sign up, the link is just there for you. Or we've got an online community that you can join. If you wanted to get in touch with me personally, my email address is now on the screen. Please feel free to do so. And I'm just going to highlight one further event that we've got coming up, which will also circulate out to you when we send you a copy of the recording and the slides. So we've got a coffee and networking event for women in innovation taking place online on the 5th of May at 2 p.m. The registration details will be sent out to you, but this is a chance to bring a small group, it will be capped, the numbers, together to have a little bit of open discussion on some of the key topics that they're facing at the moment, and to help provide advice across and help you network with some women in similar positions as yourself. So look out for that on the 5th of May, and if you'd like to join, the registration link will be sent through, and I would recommend to register as soon as possible. As I say, the numbers for that will be capped. But thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that we'll see you again at one of our future webinars. Thank you. Goodbye.